Very excited to have you here today. This is a really exciting day for us. This is a chance for us to show off some of the work that CCAPS has been doing over the past year. And as you know, it's a two-part event, new research on the impact of climate change in Africa. We hear from our wonderful partners from UNC first, and then we hope that you stay around for the second part at 2 o'clock, where Josh Busby's Policy Research Project will be presenting some of their findings. First, I'd like to thank Dr. James Harvey from DoD and Rich Engel from the National Intelligence Council for joining us from Washington today. It's a really remarkable effort for you guys to come here. We're thrilled to have you here at the Strauss Center at the LBJ School. I'd particularly like to thank Dr. Harvey and DoD for making this work possible by funding the Strauss Center's program on climate change and African political stability, or CCAPS as we call it. A core mission of the Strauss Center is partnerships and collaboration. And one of the best parts of this exciting project has been the opportunity we've had to work with and to get to know our partners from the University of North Texas, our friends Cullen and Idean. As you know, an important part of our project aims to assess how climate change could make African countries more vulnerable to humanitarian disasters and conflict, and how this in turn could affect African political stability and U.S. security. Cullen and Idean lead the program's work investigating the nexus between climate change and conflict. They've constructed an extraordinary database on conflict in Africa, tracking a broad range of political and social disorders occurring in Africa over the last 20 years. This is work that will have an enormous influence, we believe, on how scholars and policymakers understand and think about these important issues. Could not be more happy to have them as key partners on this project and with us here today. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming our CCAP partners and friends, Idean and Cullen, to the LBJ.
All right. Well, thank you all for inviting us down to Austin. It's always a pleasure to come down. It was a very nice drive. I will be presenting the first half of this talk, in which I talk about our data set, the motivation for collecting a data set on all kinds of political unrest in Africa. And then Cullen will talk a little bit about the descriptive statistics and some of the research projects that we're envisioning that will be coming out of this data collection effort. So first, why do we need a new data set on political disorder and violence? There are data sets that exist on conflict, typically defined as civil or international war. And typically, those data sets will define armed conflict as organized violence between two states, in the case of international conflict, or between a state and a non-state actor, in the case of insurgency or civil war. And we have a very rich set of data sets that examine these issues. The Correlates of War data looks at both international and civil war. The Uppsala Armed Conflicts data set has a somewhat different definition, a lower threshold on the number of deaths that they require to elevate, to be included in their data set. The Minorities at Risk data look at conflict among ethnic groups. The State Failure Task Force and the Global Terrorism Database as well use a definition of conflict or armed conflict that is really looking at conflict at the state level. And we believe that we need a much broader definition of what conflict means. Looking at war is really just the tip of the iceberg when we're discussing interactions between states and dissidents, between two states, and conflicts that don't involve the state whatsoever. So things such as coups, strikes, rioting, communal conflict in which the actors are not state actors, but actors perhaps in the periphery that fight one another with very little state involvement, repression, peaceful protests, and so on, all belong under a broad umbrella of conflict. And typically, scholars have assumed that these are lower levels or lower forms of conflict that may or may not percolate up into a full-blown war. The assumption is that there's a progression from perhaps peaceful protest to rioting to full-blown war, but those assumptions have not been tested systematically, basically because we don't have a good sense of what's going on at this level. We have great data sets that describe civil and international war in terms of their duration, their magnitude, their location, and so on, but we don't have information on other forms of conflict. In addition, it shouldn't be assumed that these are somehow minor or less important forms of unrest. Just a few examples. The March 2007 elections in Kenya led to widespread rioting in 2007 and 2008, which killed, most estimates put it right around 1,000 people, and forced a political compromise in which the two main political factions were forced into a power-sharing deal. So it had major repercussions for politics in Kenya. In our data collection effort, we've identified over 17,000 politically motivated killings in Nigeria since 1990. None of those killings escalate to the level of a full-blown civil war or an insurgency. There's a minor insurgency that's collected by some of these other data sources, but a lot of the violence in Nigeria consists of ethnic rioting, the rise of religious extremist movements along the north-south fault line, attacks against oil installations in the Niger Delta. And these, again, are not captured in typical data sets, although they have tremendous implications for politics in Nigeria and internationally. And then in the early 1990s, protests against the Zambian president, Kenneth Kaunda, actually forced regime change and forced multi-party elections, although they were largely peaceful. So we really need to understand a broader array of conflict involving dissidents and other groups. So our particular interest in this data collection project under the umbrella of the CCAPS program is to understand how climate change may or may not be related to these types of events. Now, our data set, as you'll see in a moment, has much broader implications for the study of protest and political unrest in Africa. But our particular research interests have to do with how climate change and natural disasters, environmental degradation in general, might affect conflict. So some scholars have posited recently, it's gotten a lot of attention in the news, that climate change will lead to resource scarcity, scarcity of land and water, and that this will percolate up into armed conflict. And for the most part, scholars who have addressed this quantitatively have found relatively weak or ambiguous findings with respect to civil war and international war at that high threshold. There are some findings out there that suggest that natural disasters sometimes lead to conflict, but they have been countered by contrary evidence. And for the most part, there's not a consensus that there's something there, that environmental degradation leads to conflict. Now, we believe that there might be other forms of unrest that might be more likely. So insurgency requires a significant startup cost, a level of organization, a willingness to challenge an often much more powerful state military force. And we might actually see other types of political demands being made that don't escalate to the level of insurgency or war. And the state really might not be the most appropriate target. Disputes might be very localized, involve communities far away, far removed from what's going on at the central government level, and the state just might not be the appropriate target for addressing grievances related to water scarcity, land scarcity. You might be more likely to have a conflict with your neighbor than to make demands on the state. So getting into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of the data before Cullen really talks about I'm talking about nuts and bolts, he's talking about bells and whistles. So I get the boring stuff. So this is a data collection project that is really the culmination of an entire year's worth of effort. We hired 3 coders who did a wonderful job last summer and this past academic year collecting this data at the University of North Texas. Our data set covers the entire continent from 1990 to 2009. It's still a work in progress. We still need to update through to 2009 and make sure that we fix any errors or typos. But so far we have over 6,200 events, some very significant ones as well. So how is the data set constructed? What is the data generation process? Well, basically, we relied on keyword searches in LexisNexis news archives. It took us a few weeks to get the exact search protocol down and to find the sources that we wanted, the appropriate keywords in which we got good coverage of the types of events that we wanted. But after a process of trial and error, we came up with a particular search protocol that's based on Associated Press and Agence France-Presse news wires. So we selected one English language and one French language news source. These are big wire service stories, wire service agencies. And opposed to newspapers, like the New York Times, in which there's competition for limited space, the number of news wires that stringers post on these news wires can be quite large. So we believe we have fairly good news coverage, but there are some pitfalls of relying on news sources. Some countries have much better reporting on them than others. Some countries have much better press freedoms or the ability of journalists to work than others. We believe there are some methodological issues to consider and some methodological ways to address this cross-sectional heterogeneity in reporting. We can talk that in a bit about those methodological fixes in a bit. But for the most part, we're satisfied that these are representative news sources. We also explicitly excluded Civil War events. There are many data sources that are quite good at describing civil wars, their location, their magnitude, and so on. So we explicitly excluded civil wars as defined by the Uppsala University Armed Conflicts Database. It's a data collection project that's based in Sweden at Uppsala University. But our data is fully compatible with theirs and can be certainly merged to get a broader picture of these types of events as well. So if you do the search protocol, this is an example of the types of output that comes up. So this is a search of Nigeria, I believe in 1999. When you do the search, you get 560 articles for 1999. The vast majority of them are just irrelevant, are things that we don't want to look at. So one of our search terms was strike, because we want to see if people are striking in the country. Well, there are a lot of soccer matches and cricket matches that get covered if you search for strike. So you have to sort of filter those out. And our coders probably need glasses now after doing this for hours and hours. But you see some of the types of events that pop up. For example, the fifth event, Nigerian police used tear gas to disperse a demonstration in Abuja. They clicked on that, culled the relevant information, and reported it. So what are the variables that we include, and what are the types of information that we're interested in? Well, first, the coders were asked to identify the start and end date of an event. If the end date or start date is somewhat ambiguous, that's noted. But the event can last from a few days to actually a single day to several months. And basically, we're looking for a momentum of waves of protest or waves of rioting and so on. So they identified the start and end dates. And then we have 10 event types that we have a numeric coding for. Organized and unorganized protests. The difference being, can we identify a proper noun, a leader or an organization that called for the protest? So a protest by students would be something that's unorganized, but if it were the University of Mombasa Students' Union organizing a protest, then it's a proper name. It's an organized event. We do the same for unorganized and organized rioting, and riots are instances in which there was a deliberate destruction of property or life. We look at limited strikes that are limited to one sector and general strikes. We also look at government repression. This is repression that is initiated by the government actor against some other actor. We also have repression codes for if another actor initiated an event and then the police stepped in to arrest people or fire tear gas, but this repression is initiated by the government. We also include instances of anti-government violence by organized actors that have a permanent or quasi-permanent militia associated with them. So these are things that look like insurgency or acts of terrorism that perhaps did not meet the threshold of civil war. Extra government violence might be a little bit confusing. Sometimes it's referred to as communal conflict. But extra government violence are instances in which there were two non-state actors that were organized, tribal militia, various groups in the periphery that fight one another without any state involvement. And sometimes those are quite deadly and quite horrific. But neither actor, neither the initiator or the target was a state. And then intra-government violence includes things like coups and mutinies in which one faction of the government fights another faction of the government. We actually found quite a bit of fighting between the military of a country and the police forces of a country. They would get into fights at bars sometimes and then start shooting on each other. There's a few interesting anecdotes of that. Some of the other variables we coded, we have an escalation code. So if something began, say, as a protest and then escalated to rioting, we note that. We note the actors and the targets. We have a text field that actually tells you the actor, for example, students or teachers union. But we also have a binary for whether or not that was a government. The target was the government. So did the protest demand something of the government? We record the number of participants in categories, the number of deaths. We also code whether or not the government repressed the event and whether they used lethal or non-lethal means. We also have a location code, so we identify the location of the event, and we also note whether or not, through a numeric code, whether or not it's the capital, another urban area, a rural area, and so on. And all of the location codes can be turned and will be being turned to GIS coordinates that you can put on a map. Some of that, I guess, many of you have done, and we'll see those presentations in a bit. We also include, to the best that we're able to discern it, the issues that were involved. So things such as elections, the economy, the environment, education, and we allow for multiple issue codes if there are multiple issues that are mentioned by the news story. And then a short description of the event. So these are the types of events, just a few examples of the types of events that we were able to capture. So for example, in Egypt in June of 2004, 2,000 Muslim Brotherhood members protested outside of a courthouse in support of one of their members. In Sudan in August of last year, there was a cattle raid by one group against a settlement in another group. In the Central African Republic, in May of 1996, there was a soldier mutiny in which soldiers mutinied over the failure of the government to pay them appropriately, and they actually were able to control parts of the capital for a few days. So these are the types of things that are included. Okay. The other thing that we did, and we believe this is good practice for any data collection project, unfortunately many political scientists don't do this, but we think it's very important to have inter-coder reliability checks to make sure that two coders, two people that do the search, find the events, and code the events, do so identically, or as close as possible, so that there are not disagreements about the utility of the tool, and there are not or whether or not there are ambiguities that we need to iron out. So 10% of our country years were double-coded. Were coded by more than one coder. And there are basically two issues that we had to consider. First, when people did the search and then identified the events out of potentially hundreds or thousands of newspaper articles, that they identified the same events. So if your news search produces 500 hits, we want to make sure that a dozen or 2 dozen events that make it into the data set are identically identified. And then for those cases that are double-coded, that are coded or identified by more than one person, that the informational variables are identically coded, or as close as possible again. So on the same event issue, there's basically no standard for doing this, because we don't know what the true universe of cases are. But what we are able to do is to identify the match rate. And basically, we're dealing with a needle in the haystack problem. You have thousands of potential of newspaper articles, and you need to find the gems that are in there and discard the soccer matches and so on. We found that our coders identified cases identically, 65%, so about 2/3 of the time, and we think that's fairly good. Where there was a disagreement in which some coders had additional events that others didn't, they were either usually very minor events in which there was very little reporting, or they perhaps one coder had an event as lasting for an entire month, and the same coder and a different coder saw the same event as really being two distinct episodes. So it's the same event, but they got different rows because of disagreements about start and end dates. But basically, we believe that the major events, the big disruptive events that got a lot of news reporting, a lot of news coverage, were identically found by the two coders. The other issue is, are the same events coded the same way? So all of the variables that we mentioned, do two different people see the world in the same way? The way of doing this is to calculate what's called the Cohen's kappa, in which basically you look at the percent agreement between the two coders, and you discount it by the probability that two coders would just by chance identify things the same way. Kappas above 0.61 are considered in the field as being substantial agreement. On all of our variables, we found kappas above 0.61. So we had a fairly good agreement rate on those. The one variable in which the agreement is not so good is the issue codes. So it's somewhat weaker. But when you combine some of the issue codes, like, for example, environment is one issue code, and access to food and water is another issue code. Some of those issue codes we might combine, in which our agreement rate increases substantially. We also have multiple issues, issue coding, so some of those are in secondary codes and so on. We can talk about that in a bit. But in general, we believe we have fairly good reliability between the two coders. So Cullen is going to take over and show you the fun stuff, so what you can do with this data and visualizing some of our work.
All right. Thank you, Idean. Thank you all again for being here. I guess I get to do the fun part. So after 15 months of work in terms of data collection, probably a lot of coffee, a lot of semi-sleepless nights, what do these events actually look like? Well, first we can look at them over time, summing across all of the countries. So this is just, what you're seeing here is a time series broken down by the type of event, beginning in 1990 and then up to 2008. As Idean mentioned, we're going to be updating this to 2009 in the coming couple of weeks. Now, what we see here, there's a lot going on, so I'd just like to draw your attention to a couple of things. The first thing that I'd like you to notice is something that we think is actually pretty neat, is that you see kind of a stepwise increase in the level of both protest and rioting coming around 1999 or 2000, right? So it increases from a mean level that's pretty consistent, right, in the previous period. And we think that a lot of this just simply has to do with the fact that you have a wave of democratization overtaking the continent during this time period, which is opening up a political realm to this type of contestation, right? It's opening it up, the opportunity for groups to mobilize publicly, right, in an attempt to get their grievances addressed by the government. All right, what we see, interestingly, is that events like strikes don't seem to be particularly sensitive to regime type. And then also, I just wanted to mention that non-state violence here appears to be on the uptick in the last couple of years. All right, we've seen somewhat of a decline in protest and riot behavior, but we're seeing a continent-wide increase in this type of non-state violence. The majority of that, we think, is actually communal violence that Idean described previously. You'll see that it spikes up here in 1993. We think that a lot of that is actually driven by the Somali case. All right, in terms of the numbers of events, the total numbers of events here, we coded 6,226 of these events. All right, and this breaks out the countries according to those that had the most and those that had the fewest events. Now, obviously, a lot of this is going to be driven by population. So the countries that are at the highest end in terms of the number of events are some of the largest countries on the continent. But we also think that these patterns probably do tell us something about the general level of political contestation in these societies. And so it's actually informative if we look at the other end of the distribution and see those countries that have been sort of the most politically quiet or politically stable. All right, we see Eritrea probably winds up on that list because of lack of reporting. All right, so we're going to have to address that methodologically. But I think, Mauritius, Botswana, and Namibia, these are places that have been held up as being paragons of political stability in the region. All right, so we think that these data jibe with sort of our back-of-the-envelope understanding of levels of political stability in these countries. All right, in terms of the number of deaths we identified, continent-wide we identified almost 79,000 politically motivated or politically related deaths that had not appeared in other data sets on political violence in Africa. Okay, we think that's a relatively large number. 22,000 of those events occurred in Democratic Republic of Congo, which, as I'm sure you all know, was racked by, or has been racked by, almost constant warfare and relatively large-scale warfare through this entire period. Right? These are not deaths that are actually associated with the Civil War. Right? A lot of these deaths are being driven by these inter-ethnic conflicts that are occurring separately from the conflict between rebel forces and state actors. All right? Nigeria, as Idean mentioned earlier, in terms of the way that conflict data sets look at Nigeria, heretofore it's been considered a relatively peaceful country. Yet we were able to identify about 17,500 politically motivated killings there. All right, so the picture looks very different. Kenya did not have a civil war during any of this time period, yet we still identify almost 4,700 politically motivated or linked deaths. And then at the other end of the distribution, again, it just sort of confirms what we sort of thought by just looking at the raw numbers of events. All right, so these countries we think are actually relatively stable. Congo might be a little bit suspicious on this part of the list, but what we found was that the overwhelming majority of the violence there was actually tied to the internal civil conflict. And then finally, I just thought you might be interested in looking at the rates at which these events are repressed. Right? So this is something that's of a lot of interest to political scientists, which is how do states respond to actions that are targeted against them, but also actions that are targeted against members of society. Right? I mean, this is one of the compelling rationales for why it is we have these territorially defined states in the first place, right? So that they can regulate the use of violence within their territories. Okay? And what we see is that there's a wide degree of variation in the degree to which they actually repress these events. All right? I should mention that this table is separate from those events that were coded as government repression. So where the government proactively goes and kicks down someone's door, black bags them, and takes and puts them in prison, right? So these are events like if you have a protest or a riot, right, this takes place, does the government actually go out and use tear gas, rubber bullets, live fire, that sort of thing? All right, so Somalia is in last place on this list, which kind of makes sense since Somalia hasn't had a state for most of the time period under analysis, right? We're just now starting to dig into this, and we think that this is going to be a real interesting part of the project. I don't think we necessarily need to say too much more about that right now. But if you have any questions about this, we'd be happy to entertain them a little bit later. All right, so when we went into this, our assumption was that one of the most important things that we could do in terms of a contribution would be to identify instances of political violence or political disturbances that were not targeted at the state. All right? We have a very state-centric kind of view of political stability, and we have a very state-centric view of conflict. And we thought that by enlarging the scope a little bit, we were going to catch a lot of events that were not targeted against the government. Well, thankfully, it actually worked out that way. So about 2,900 of the events did target the government, but the majority, about 3,300 or 3,400, were not targeted against the government. Right? They were targeted against other private actors, right? Or they were targeted against corporations in the case of strikes. Right? So the data, at least at this first blush, and I should say we've only had a couple of days actually now looking at the full data set, it does jibe with our understanding of what we thought we were likely to see when we went into it. All right. This will give you an idea of events and deaths over time. Right? So that the bloodiest year in our data set would be 1993. Again, I believe that a lot of that's driven by the Somali case. And then we see another uptick in deaths right around this period of some democratization, but also second, highly contested elections in many of the countries that had democratized earlier in the time period here. And then the political deaths tended to taper off in the early part of the 2000s. Okay, and we'll get to this, I think, yes, in the next slide. different types of events are characterized by very different levels of violence in terms of actual the deaths associated with them. Right? So what are all these events about? The total events by main issue, human rights and democracy, in particular democratization, were driving most of the events that we observed, or that was the plurality of the events that we observed. The economy and jobs, right? That seems to, that jibes with our understanding of what tends to motivate people to act collectively, to attempt to either redistribute resources or redistribute political power to themselves in times where they are aggrieved. Right. But interestingly enough, for the CCAPS team, environmental degradation was not the main issue at the heart of very many of these events. Okay? And we were a little bit worried about that until we started thinking about it, I guess, a little bit more deeply, and realized that a lot of the violence that we think is going to be motivated by environmental degradation is not going to be a response in particular to the environmental degradation itself, but the effect that it has on the resource bases on which these populations are contingent, right? So if you have a population that's dependent on a well, right, for their access to clean drinking water, and that well dries up because of a drought, right? That may be environmentally, that may be caused distantly by the environment, right, or environmental or weather variability, but proximately that's going to manifest itself as a protest or an instance of violence over access to economic resources, okay? And then in terms of just looking at deaths, it's pretty clear here that what are coded as ethnically motivated events are driving most of the deaths in our data set at this point. Okay, we also thought it would be interesting to look at repression by event type, so different patterns of government responses to the different events that we've collected here, and to see if they vary kind of systematically. Again, we're just getting started with this, but a couple of the things we think are probably going to hold up in further analysis. The first is that rioting of both types tends to be repressed more, and this is statistically significant, than protest. I mean, this makes a lot of intuitive sense, right? If you're mobilizing and intentionally going out with the intent to inflict harm, right, or damage property, it's likely that the state is going to become involved. The other thing that I would like to draw your attention to here is this column of extra government violence. Recall that this is violence, right, between relatively highly organized militias or communal groups that does not involve the state. Okay? Less than 6% of the time are these events actually repressed by the state. Less than 6% of the time does the state actually get involved in trying to punish either or both of these actors. Right? So much of this violence is going on, the state is not just absent from the situation in the sense that they are not the direct target of the violence, but also subsequent to that violence, they choose not to get involved and attempt to repress or punish the actors that are involved. And we think that that's very interesting. You'll hear a lot more about this pretty soon, but we just wanted to throw in a little shout out to the group here at UT Austin who have been diligently taking a lot of these conflict data, because we have locational data, and putting them into GIS so that we can place them on a map, right? So we can see if they overlap with areas that we know to be experiencing environmentally induced scarcity, right? So droughts, flooding, that sort of thing. Right? We don't have to just look at it at the aggregate national level. We can drill down a little bit and see if patterns of actual scarcity link up with the observed locational patterns of the events in the data set. So that's pretty cool, and you're going to hear a lot more about that pretty soon. Okay. I wanted to briefly just tell you about one application of these data that we've done so far, and it's based on a preliminary version of these data that only include about a third of the observations. So as Idean mentioned, our interest in this is exploring this climate and conflict nexus. All right? We think that what we're doing here is we're offering a different way of thinking about and measuring conflict and instability. Right? He mentioned the rationale for that in a lot more detail. We also are thinking about a different way of conceptualizing environmental scarcity. So instead of looking at long-term trends in dwindling resources or desertification. We're actually looking at kind of variables that are going to vary on a much more compressed kind of time scale. So variation in the weather and the effect that that has on the availability of water. All right, so we're looking at rainfall deviations from long-term means. What that means is that we have data on rainfall for Kenya from 1979 to the present. Right? And on a year-by-year basis, we can say relative to the average level of rainfall in Kenya and relative to the observed level that it varies naturally, right? How good a year or how bad a year was a particular year in terms of rainfall? How abundant was it? How scarce was it? Relative to what the expectations are at that country. All right? And that, surprisingly, is sort of a new way of conceptualizing this in these sorts of studies. And then we also looked at extreme events, extreme discrete weather events in terms of droughts and floods. All right, so in our econometric analysis, one of the things that has jumped out is that we have this curvilinear response of events to either extremely scarce rainfall or extremely abundant rainfall. All right, so what we're looking at here is the percentage change in the number of these events from the mean expected amount for the individual country panel, right? And its response to changes in these standardized rainfall deviations. Now, what that means is just that what we're looking at here is essentially a distribution that's going to cover about 95% of all rainfall events. Right? This is essentially a 1 in 20 bad year. That would be a 1 in 20 good year. And what we see is that it responds to both of them. All right? So you have an estimated 150% increase, right? So a little bit more than doubling in years where you have abundant rainfall. But you get between a 250 and 300% increase in years where you have very, very dry years. Okay? So it's curvilinear, but the effect is asymmetric. Less water is more politically destabilizing than very abundant water. When looking at discrete events, a different type of pattern emerges, and this, we think, actually highlights the importance of thinking about a larger suite of violent outcomes and also leveraging the information that's in the data set. Okay, so what we found here is that droughts, right, in the previous year were associated with an increase in the number of these type of disturbance events in the following year, but it did not have the same type of effect on all type of events. Right? So it had no statistically significant impact on nonviolent events, but it had a very strong impact on violent events. And then separately, getting to the issue of targeting, right, government-targeted events did not become much more prevalent, but non-government targeted events, so events that are targeted against other societal actors, actually do increase markedly in the year after a drought. Okay, and if there are any questions about this model specification later, I'd be happy to entertain those. All right, and this is not just for people who want to use these data to inform quantitative research. All right, that's our particular hobby horse at this time, but we think that you can do a lot more with it. And we think it's a much more valuable tool because of that. So for qualitative social scientists and journalists, NGOs, I mean, you can probably think of a variety of actors who would be interested in these sort of data. They're useful for generating descriptive statistics. Right? You've seen some of the descriptive statistics. And then also for event histories. Right? And we also think it's nice that the way that the data are constructed, we're very above board and open about how it was that we identified events, so that people can go back, use the search protocol, identify the original reporting on these events, and they can fill in any of the kind of gaps in their knowledge, right, and generate a more kind of compelling, rich narrative around these types of events. So I'll give you just one quick application. I think we were all horrified by the recent massacre in Jos, right? As reported in the London Times, officials estimated that 500 people were massacred in nighttime raids by Muslim gangs near Jos, the city that bestrides Nigeria's Christian-Muslim fault line. Let's say you were a reporter or you were an NGO and you were interested in whether this was some sort of outlier type of event, if this was something that was relatively infrequent, or if it fit into a longer-term pattern of violent interaction between these two groups. Well, using our database, right, and looking at events that were located in Jos, we were able to identify several previous events that were of roughly the same magnitude as the most recent massacre. So in 2008, you have ethnic rioting that is initiated by Muslim groups that kill 700 people. And that occurred previously in 2001 as well. Right? So we can see that there does appear to be some sort of pattern and routine to this interaction. Okay? And that's something that's useful whether or not you want to do negative binomial count models. Right? This is just useful in terms of background information and developing a narrative. Okay? We've talked a lot about this already within the CCAPS team, but we think the degree to which it's actually going to go out and inform the larger research community and the policy community and the NGO community is going to be contingent on how the data are made available. Right? Social scientists typically do a really bad job of this. We tend to put an HTML link to a CSV file, right? It's not exactly the sexiest way of presenting a year's worth of data collection, right? So what we're going to be doing, and the CCAPS is going to be, the team here at the Strauss Center is going to be leading the way on this, is going to be constructing an online searchable database. Right, that is going to make these data much more accessible to a broader community, is going to allow for the generation of real-time maps, probably real-time tables and charts, that sort of thing. It's going to be fantastic. All right. It's not just useful for climate-related research. I mean, obviously, a lot of other types of research questions can be addressed using data of this type. So when do states repress dissidents? Right. Previously, we've had to rely on sort of snapshot large-scale indicators that just say, you know, in the Gambia last year, repression was at a moderate level. All right, now we can drill down and look at individual events and patterns of repression. So we think that that's pretty exciting. We can look at the relationship between protests and other types of political disturbance events and regime longevity. Right? That's probably a pretty big deal if we think that these types of events are likely to destabilize political systems and potentially, right, ultimately cause state failure. Which countries experience the most non-state violence? We think that that's a big contribution that we can make here. We hope to make that relatively quickly. We know that there's a lot of election-associated violence. Right? There are lots of protests leading up to elections, and there are lots of riots afterwards. Right? But actually identifying the particular dynamics of those types of election-related disturbances are going to be something that we're interested in doing. And then finally, just the broad question of how does economic development influence protests? Right, these are just some of the questions we can answer. And at that point, or excuse me, at this point, we're done with our formal presentation, and we wanted to use this as a jumping off. What's that? Oh, yes. Thank you. We're done with our formal part of the presentation. We're very interested in your reactions, any comments that you might have, and any suggestions about other things that you can do with these type of data. All right, these data are the CCAPS data. They're meant to be used. So thank you all very much.
Questions, comments, reactions?
Couple questions. We got to talk. A couple questions. One related to the search. Are the searches such that they could be transported to other databases? For example, if someone had another database, is there any reason why the search couldn't be moved to another database, providing that the Lexis protocol could be translated to whatever protocol that other database used?
Yeah, as long as you have access to Associated Press and Agence France Presse news feeds, and you have a way of filtering the news feeds. We searched on several terms: protest, riot,
No, I was more interested
strike.
in the terms, not the news feeds. Actually, a different set of
terms?
data. Yeah.
Oh, certainly. I mean,
Yeah.
you could use different search terms and either follow our code book, our coding
Right.
rubric, or tweak them however you wish to include other types of events that perhaps we didn't include.
I noticed you had environment, and then you had food, water, and I thought it was scarcity as a separate issue. Did you consider breaking out food and water from water instead of putting them both together?
No, I mean, we had one code for economic resources or assets, such as control of mines, oil wells, and so on. And we had one to basically capture protests over food prices, water availability, and so on. But we counted food and water as sort of subsistence crises, and we gave it a single issue coding. But the advantage of what we've done is that we have issue notes as well, in which we have a short description of the event. And it would be very plausible to look through the issue notes, the short description of the event, and disaggregate the water and the food event.
This probably didn't affect your data for the period of time you looked at because it was relatively short, but I want you to kind of intellectually think through a longer look at a set of data. In some cases, I would hypothesize that some events are kind of urban related because they require a large number of people before they're going to trigger, or they're urban related because they require a reporting mechanism that is in proximity to see the event even took place.
Right.
So if one sees larger amounts of urbanization in Africa or any part, one would normally expect the numbers would rise, not because the rates necessarily have changed, but because you have just larger urban areas.
Right.
So somehow you have to kind of think through, how am I going to account for demographic and particularly urbanization changes over time?
Right. No, I've done a little bit of thinking about that, and one of the interesting things I think is that I think that we're going to find different responsiveness to urbanization amongst the different types of events. So I think it's very clear. I think it's very clear that you would see that kind of dynamic when you have protests and riots. Right. I mean, these are inherently urban types of events, right? I don't know necessarily that you would see that kind of responsiveness with respect to extra-governmental violence, which is primarily a rural phenomenon. It happens less in the urban areas because these are areas in which the state is relatively prevalent and has a relative monopoly on use of force. I mean, we do see some of that occurring in urban areas, but I think that the responsiveness is going to be different. But yes, I mean, that's clearly something that we'd like to look at in our research.
The other thing that your question points to is the issue of reporting bias. I mean, certain areas are simply going to be reported on better than others. And we're basically reliant on what journalists are able to tell us. And that's true of all social science research, that you're just going to have a better picture of what's happening in these urban areas. But if we believe that there are reporting biases that we can identify and we can theorize about that, then we can include the appropriate controls in our statistical analysis. So if we think that urbanization, that's actually a great point, if we think that urbanization is related to reporting, then we can include urbanization on the right-hand side of our regression to account for just differences in base levels of reporting. Right. So that's an excellent suggestion.
And there are data that are available on relative levels of press freedom too, right? So that's going to help. I mean, that's a little bit tricky because that's an indicator of state repression, right? It's probably highly correlated with other regime characteristics, but also would give us some leverage on this issue of kind of cross-sectional variation in the amount of reporting that comes out of these societies.
Other data that has looked at water research, Aaron Wolf's data, has made the observation that the correlation with water-related violence, and I will not do justice to his words, but it's fundamentally a function of the rate of change of the water availability in combination, I would say, with the robustness of the institutions that are attempting to cope with it.
Right.
The worst case being high rates of change of water availability and poor institutional capability to cope. There, they lead to the most likely case of disruption. So there is a rate of change issue that plays in there. Is it possible to pull that out of the data set?
You're absolutely right, and we're definitely influenced by Aaron Wolf's work, and that's on the rainfall side, on the water availability side, and we can certainly look at rates of change over time and interact them with institutional variables. If we believe that certain regimes are more resilient to that change, we can certainly include them in our regression analyses.
The final thing, I just make a comment that I think a lot of what you're really dealing with is not necessarily climate change. I would argue your timeline is too narrow for real climate change. What you are looking at is extreme weather events. And there is an argument to be made that significant changes in the frequency and character of extreme weather events is a climate change phenomenon. But I would tease that the time frame you're looking at, that's going to be very hard to pull out. I will say that I was at a review the other day where the CIA is looking at environmental indications and warning. And it was interesting that they were looking at a method very similar to the way you described what I would call a statistical method to look at anomalies, anomalies in distributions and frequencies to try and tease out changes. And so it was very similar to some of the work you did. I don't, that work is, I'm not sure if they're ever going to publish it, but nonetheless it was interesting to parallel some of the stuff you've been doing.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Other hand? So, some of you I know have been mapping this data, so if you have
Yeah.
questions for exactly
Right.
where they come from.
Right.
Well, so I'm just going to ask kind of curiosity questions, maybe. So you have this big point of not trying to duplicate other people's work, because this is, I don't know, hard and takes a lot of resources. So why would you want to duplicate what else is out there? But in the results that you present, here's descriptive statistics of our data, it's hard for me to understand what's going on because you're excluding other people's data. And so if you could comment a little, I mean, I'm I don't know, I get lost in the weeds easily. So so I will phrase my question in terms of weeds, and you can maybe try to generalize a little bit. But there are two huge sets of events that I think you think are largely absorbed by civil wars, yet I'm sure some of it leaks into your data, which are, say, the '94 conflict in Rwanda and the DRC conflict later in the decade, mostly later in the decade. And so you partly claim, oh, there's escalating deaths and there's something going on in the DRC. It was 20-some thousand people in a context where we think 5 million people are dying. And so how you pick the events that you think are important to count and separate that from the other ones, and how you account for kind of general tendencies, like your comments about, see, in 1999 there was this uptick, or these kinds of things, in the context of there's a whole lot of other stuff you're leaving out. Like, why do you point to Somalia in 1993 as a spike that you get to count? But it seems like there's a ton of extra state violence in Rwanda in '94, which would dwarf your numbers, except that somehow you're soaking most of that up in the Civil War, even though I bet most of that's not. It is Civil War because the government's a power-sharing government. That's kind of a quirk of the previous peace process, and if it hadn't been a power-sharing government, you would have coded this differently, right? You would have coded it as extra regime violence. And so, I don't know, I'm in the weeds on trying to understand Somalia, Rwanda, Congo, but maybe there's a broader way that you can encapsulate your response.
I mean, I think that one thing, and your point is extremely well taken, because I hope that we caveated enough up front to say that we are explicitly excluding certain types of violence. Our reason for doing that here is not because we don't think that those are important, or that we don't think that it would alter potentially markedly the kind of patterns that we're seeing, the temporal patterns, right? The reason that we're doing that is because partially it's just about presentation. I mean, what we were doing here today was trying to not give a comprehensive snapshot of all of the political violence that is going on in Africa during this time period, but highlighting our particular contribution to that, and then, right, once we've got that worked out, we can then integrate our data into these other sources of data, right? So the Rwandan genocide is going to be captured in that, right? The DRC conflict is going to be captured there as well. So yes, 22,000 additional deaths identified in DRC. That is somewhat of a drop in the bucket, right? Compared to the extreme levels of violence that we're seeing. But we think that it does kind of enrich our understanding of the conflict to realize that part of the complexity of the conflict is not just that you had changing state actors and changing rebel opposition movements, but also while this violence is taking place in this context of elevated levels of anarchy, right, you've got intercommunal violence that's going on as well. So I think that if you roll them all together, right, you're going to get a slightly broader view of the suite of political violence.
Say it a little bit simply, is that if you wanted to merge the correlates of war and or the Uppsala data set into this, It would change the pictures, but it could be done. I mean, it's
Why is your picture an interesting picture, given that? It's kind of what I'm saying. You're right. This is the data you're adding. You're trying to tell us, oh, what did we add? And so that's fine. But substantively, what could I learn?
For example, in the Uppsala armed conflict data set, which is widely used and widely cited, there's one insurgency in Nigeria that is in 2004, and that's in the Niger Delta, right? It kills maybe 55 people, according to their data set. We identified 17,000 politically motivated killings in Nigeria that are not related to a civil conflict. If you look at the Uppsala conflict data set or the correlates of war, Kenya is a country that's at peace. Kenya has never experienced a civil war or an insurgency, but we find 5,000 politically motivated deaths over a 20-year period. And those data sets are simply missing that. Now, we could easily fold in other data sets and get a somewhat different picture, but in the correlates of war, for example, Nigeria is coded as just as peaceful as Norway. And we don't think that that's appropriate.
I just want to follow up on that. So essentially, and this is a presentation about the new data, but I think what Eugene is getting at, and is an interesting question, is how one would theorize about the relationship between these factors in civil war and your conflicts in civil war. And I completely understand that you would add on and you could generate and do some things together with these other data sets, but do you have any observations from looking at those data sets before at how your types of events trend differently or trend in similar ways? And just in general, what the relationship is between civil war and these sort of below state level, non-civil war types of violent events?
We haven't done the comparison. I mean, and we easily could. Now, I was actually a little bit surprised in that the typical assumption in a lot of the literature, if you look at, say, GER's mobilization models, is that things start at a certain level and they escalate, and then they break a threshold of civil war, and there you go. We're actually a little bit surprised to find that some countries have a lot of violence that's defined as organized armed conflict between a rebel group and a state, a civil war. And some countries have all kinds of violence that never percolate up to a civil war, don't reach those conventional thresholds. So South Africa becomes very violent in the mid-1990s. You have fights between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party. Kenya becomes very violent as rival militias and tribal groups battle in peripheral areas. Nigeria becomes very violent, but they don't have full-blown state failure civil war. So they're related, and they're related questions, and we definitely need to look at how civil wars compared to these types of events, look at trends over time, look at fatalities, and so on. Look at if the same covariates that explain civil war also explain rioting and protests and so on. We're not at that stage yet, because we really finished this data on Monday.
But, I mean, yeah.
So your examples are interesting. So one of them, like the South Africa example, right? Violence between ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party. There's some reason why you choose to code it this way rather than the other, but do you think it's actually substantively different in some way, in the sense that I think most people think of that as essentially a civil war in townships, right? It's for control of areas that the central government sort of cares about, but sort of has this decentralized power structure, right? And in the end, there's a deal that ends this violence in a way. But is that different from somehow the other kinds of civil wars you have in other countries, or is that the same?
Well, at this point, I don't think that we can answer that question. But I guess what I would say is that before if you haven't collected these types of data, it's going to be very difficult to identify in a more broadly comparative context the sample of cases that actually look like that, right? Where you have if we don't know that it's going on, right, and we don't see that there's some sort of inter-ethnic rivalry that is militarized and takes place over a period of time and then ends at some point, right? We don't know the extent to which that dynamic is going to be replicated in other countries. I mean, just having sort of looked at the data, I think that we're going to be able to identify some kind of enduring rivalries where you see these patterns of violence kind of They persist over long periods of time. And then, you know, getting back to the other question that you posed, right, this allows us to ask pretty theoretically interesting decisions. So at what point, you know, do you get that pattern, right? If the South African government had decided to pick a winner in that conflict and throw its military weight behind it, that would have become a civil war, right? Because it would be getting involved. But what we see is a lot of fairly large-scale violence, you know, where you have thousands of deaths. I mean, conflicts that are much larger than many of the civil conflicts that exist in these data sets, right? But because the state never chooses to get involved and never really either takes a side or gets involved in repressing the actors, they don't show up in the way that political scientists conventionally think about armed conflict.
Sort of thinking through under the conditions under which this sort of escalation model would apply. When do states then sort of graduate from the threshold of low-level violence to civil war, and when do they not? So you've sort of identified that some countries don't do that, and so I think as a sort of prospective research area would be to try and theorize that and explore that a bit. The other side of it would be, from the U.S. foreign policy perspective, you know, why should we care? So do we only care when it escalates? I mean, you've identified some countries that, like Kenya and Nigeria, that, you know, look as peaceful as Norway, but then, so on some level I kind of get what the strategic significance of the U.S. might be, but I don't know if you could explain a little bit, you know, why we should care about universe of cases that perhaps the level of deaths, you know, is much lower in terms of impact than we see, like in the Congo, you know, that we've observed over the last you know, decade or so. So would we only care about those cases when they do graduate to extreme violence, or are there other reasons that we might care even if the violence levels don't kill large numbers of people?
There are a lot of interests that are at stake there. I mean, if you look at the oil-rich Niger Delta region, right, it affects global oil prices. We import a lot of oil from Nigeria. Large number of deaths, a long pattern of violence in the Niger oil delta that doesn't become state failure, state collapse, full-blown civil war, but affects U.S. interest. And protests have sometimes caused U.S. allies to fall, or for example, the Kenyan violence in 2008. Kenya was essentially an anchor in a very volatile East Africa region. You know, we have Somalia in the north. It has a long coast. We've had bombings of embassies. We've had instances of religious extremism in parts of Kenya as well. So the rioting that occurs around the elections can really threaten U.S. interests if it can destabilize our friends and allies.
Well, and
I guess I also would add to the observation there is that if you sometimes small events that are early indicators of bigger fault lines. Whereas you know a state has a certain set of ethnic, economic disparity, or religious fault lines, and even small one or two events, one or two people being hurt or killed, can start to make you have concern that this is going to fracture in a much bigger way somewhere down the line. And obviously, an earlier invention is better than a late invention.
I mean, the one of the things that we'd like to do is see if, you know, we can use this as a canary in the coal mine, right? So, contingent on observing this level of protest or this level of extra government violence, does state failure become more likely in the next year or in a 5-year time period?
I mean, if you combined it, you certainly reference the political instability task force work, which you've looked at. But if you look at a lot of that work, it doesn't necessarily predict the state is going to fail. It predicts a certain propensity to fail given a triggering event. So what the database may show you is whether or not you're starting to approach, or even if regrettably, early stages of a triggering event has occurred. But I think that's going to take analysis outside of I'm just not optimistic numbers alone are going to do that. You said qualitative and quantitative. That's going to be a qualitative judgment.
One of the things we did on a very early, not with the full data set, but with a smaller sample, is we actually looked at Civil War events as a dependent variable and our events as an independent variable. We actually found that our protest and riot and strike events don't predict Civil War very well. maybe we need
Right.
to look at the fuller data set and sort of tease out
Right.
complex dynamics that escalate to that point. But in our very first cut preliminary statistical runs, these things don't tend to predict civil war, at least in the way that we've looked at them, which are very raw, simple correlations.
Mhm.
I'm curious if you, the event only, in terms of their relationship with the state, you were only concerned with the state of which the event was located, in terms of not violence that happened in a state where those groups or actors are actually concerned with the government of a different state.
Okay.
That could be in there.
Thinking of examples like the
There are examples where, like, a lot of
the groups in Eastern
Israelis in
Congo
Kenya.
are concerned with the government of Rwanda,
Yeah.
not the government of the DRC. I mean, some of them are concerned with the government of the DRC, but then others are.
Yeah, you had a lot of protests by Zimbabweans in South Africa against the Mugabe regime. Those are counted as protests in South Africa because they physically are located in South Africa. But there's an issue code that says these are about foreign affairs, foreign events, and the target is listed as Zimbabwe.
Right.
Okay.
And these are relatively prevalent too. I mean, these are a non-trivial portion of the total events.
And you also get cross-border attacks, for example. So Pokot cattle raiders in northern Uganda cross the border into Kenya and launch an attack in Kenya and then go back across the border. Well, it's counted as an event in Kenya, but we can identify that occurred across the border.
Hi, this is a little more a technical question. It has to do with the coding. Looking at Kenya specifically, you have some events for which there are no deaths, right? And I think this is the majority of the cases, or 500 plus events in Kenya. But then you have some events that have 1,500 deaths. How do you come up with this figure of 1,500? Because you have some nationwide events that we had a hard time coding. We weren't sure if we were going to attribute these events at the provincial level. And so if you could tell us a little more about how you coded these.
Where we came up with the deaths number in particular? Yeah, what we used were the most widely cited reports or the most recent reporting. So often, the Kenyan, during the Kenyan elections, for example, there were wildly varying reports of the numbers of deaths, but oftentimes a week or two afterwards, you would get reports, and they would come to a consensus position, but they're typically ranges. And the encoders were instructed to give a best guess estimate, but we also have a field that indicates ambiguity that we don't know. So if there were a relatively small number of events, like 3 people were killed when police opened fire, we actually know that 3 people were killed. But when you have large events, it'll say 5 to 600, and you'll get a range, and you won't have that precision. So one thing that could very easily be done if you're not satisfied with the level of precision is to turn the variable into a categorical variable, in which you have categories. Because again, at the higher levels, they become a little bit murkier, a little bit fuzzier. The death estimates are very politically contested. Different actors have different reasons for reporting different numbers of deaths, but in all cases, we looked for the most reported and the most recently reported numbers.
So, let's say there are riots in 12 towns in Kenya on the same day going on after this election. This is a national event. You might want to know 1,500 people died across the nation. You might want to know that 436 people died in one town and 800 people died in the other town.
We would really like to know that.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, not that fair precision. Let's say 400 versus 800 or something like that.
Right.
But there are lots of different ways to decide, particularly if you're saying counting the number of events. You could obviously decide this is 12 events in different towns or one event. And in the news story, it's probably, oh, yeah, there were riots today in Kenya. But you know that's not the real event, and you have to make some judgment about the correlation between the level of violence in towns, or which towns are playing off each other to have a riot and which ones are separate. I mean,
we just can't.
Yeah.
If that's what reporters are reporting.
Yeah.
1,000 deaths across Kenya. We don't know how many occurred in Eldoret and how many occurred in Nairobi. And
So
how
does
many
this
occurred
suggest to you that your number of deaths number is a more useful number, or your number of events number is a more useful number, right? Because your number of events sounds now quite arbitrary, right? We can't decide whether it's 1 or 12. It's some
Why is
number
it
of
arbitrary?
events. Well, because you know the riots actually were in 12 different places. Right.
Once we have once we have, right now they're coded, I mean, when we talk about events, we're talking literally about lines on a spreadsheet at this point, right? So once they've been georeferenced, right, we'll get some leverage on that. So if it occurred in 12 towns and the location was listed as 12 towns, the researcher can then make the distinction of whether or not that's one event or those are in fact counting as 12 events. Now, it may, I don't know that it's arbitrary, but to the extent that it's arbitrary, you can at least be systematic about which arbitrary coding you're going to want to follow, and I think that that's probably the most we can ask out of most of these kind of conflict data sets. Now, the problem that you identified is that we can't pinpoint where the deaths are taking place, and that's just something that the reporting isn't there.
But that's a different, so there are two things, right? There's one, you don't know where the deaths are, but the other is the number of events, right, that you're projecting, say, trends. Your very first summary statistic is the number of events of different types over time, right? And these may all be, have the same level of kind of error in measurement, like not systematically increasing the tendency to code it as 12 rather than 1 over time or something like that. So I'm not questioning the trends, but you could code any of these if you're trying to draw some inference about how many events take place or what correlates with more events or less events.
But this is a methodological bet that we make as social scientists, right? So you can either see World War II as one event that begins in a year, that ends in a year. It's one large event, or you can see it as a series of battles that are discrete, and you have some fighting in Europe and some fighting in the Pacific theater, and they're disconnected events. So as social scientists, we've made the bet that we should treat World War II or the post-election rioting in Kenya as one large event because the issues, the actors, the momentum were all connected as part of a discrete category of issues. So we could disaggregate further, right? So we could say we want to count each instance of rock throwing in this riot and get even more disaggregated. But for data availability reasons, for the way these things are reported, we treat these things as one event. And different researchers have made different methodological bets about this. So do we call the Rwandan genocide one event that lasts 3 months that kills 800,000 people, or do we count it as 200 separate massacres that kill a different number of people? And can we accurately know what happened in each of those massacres? And that's the call that we made. And I think it's a good one, but others have tried to disaggregate these events in a much more fine-grained level, and that's fine too.
Raleigh, our other research partner on this, has a different data set on conflict location event data that does it on a daily basis, right? So your Kenya strike data each day would be a separate event, right? Is that, if I understand her coding?
In hers.
And so rather that you've aggregated, so instead of it being a series of daily strikes or riots, it's one event over that month or that 3 months, whereas hers would be 3 months of individual events. And so I mean, I guess it's just a different bet on what would actually work best. But you could do it both ways, I suppose, and that's a lot more work. And
if you're looking at a phenomenon like civil war, right? We think right now we have a pretty good idea of what the universe of cases are, right? Or Uppsala will tell us that going by their definition, they've got pretty comprehensive reporting on that, right? So then if you're looking at within those events, you might be able to disaggregate, but typically these are pretty protracted, right? It's going to be much more difficult. If there was a day of nationwide rioting in Kenya and there were actually riots in 5 different cities, you're not going to have the level of reporting, and you're not going to be able to identify that event ex ante because it already exists in somebody else's data set. So,
Other questions?
This is very exciting. You bringing these great results to us, and product of
obviously some amazing work in the last 15 months. So please join me in thanking Cullen and Idean.
Thank you, guys. And definitely, I want to say, especially for the students that are involved and that are going to be using this, if you have questions or concerns or comments like the ones that were raised, please let us know. And in the future, as we're rolling this out, if there are particular suggestions for how to best disseminate this information, we're more than willing to listen to suggestions.